as long as I can remember, if I'm honest, I felt like there's something not quite right in the world. And I suspect that's a feeling many of us share. And I've been doing my little bit for trying to sort of improve things along the way, as all of us have, sometimes with more success than others. Um, but I have to say, over the last, certainly over the last year or so, and particularly through conversations that I've been having with Jose, who's on the call, it's been helping me sort of pull into focus uh, a more profound sense of disquiet, if you like, that I have around how things are and how things could be better and all the rest of it. And I've started to capture this for myself just under the phrase moral outrage, which is kind of surprising because back when I was at uni and I did a philosophy degree, I did moral philosophy, and the conclusion I came to was that talking about morality is morally corrupting. It's much more useful to talk about things like kindness and so on. And in my consulting work, I usually talk about things like fellowship and empathy, which feel just about as far away from outrage as you can get. Um, so maybe this is just some sort of adverse reaction to those other things in my life. But nonetheless, I think there is something around this idea of moral outrage that feels to me important if we're really wanting to sort of make a difference in the world. That's what I want to explore with you. There's a precursor to this, which is just before Christmas. Some of the people that are on this call and that are involved in the Next Stage Radicals community of practice, which incidentally is open to anyone who would like to join it. Um, we had an initial discussion about this idea of moral outrage, and I shared a number of stories that I find outraging and asked us to kind of reflect on what that meant. I'm not going to repeat that session with you, partly because it just about brought me to tears, if I'm honest, but in a good way. Um, Partly because I don't want to bore those that are on the call that have heard it before. But what I do want to do today is kind of share with you the stuff that I've kind of landed on out the back of that conversation that I think is important, but as I've already said, I think is provoking, is probably divisive. And what I'd like for us all to do is have a good old discussion around where are we each coming from, and what does that tell us about how we sort of make the world a better place. So, um, so let's see how many of you are here in 10 minutes time. uh, okay, I'm going to share some slides with you, and I've prepared a bit of a script for myself. Um, so can I ask you, just since I can only see some of you, Sam, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see those slides? Fab. Okay. So let's start here. Since the dawn of humanity, it's been the same movie on repeat. An endless showreel of the interplay between people and their context, where each exerts influence on the other such that each is the cause and each is the effect. Put that another way, the way the world works is a product of the behavior we feed it with, and the behavior we feed it with is a product of the way the world works. The nature of this causation isn't direct or linear. It's not a simple determinism at work. My behavior isn't wholly responsible for the way the world works, just as yours isn't. It's not even that our behavior collectively is the cause, because the way the world works is a product of generations of accumulated behavior and more besides. But you'll get the point. We have agency. We shape the way the world works, just as we are shaped by it. And as it shapes us, we're not excused from our behavior. We don't get to take the Nuremberg defense. Our actions are our own, and that they have a context allows us reasons, but not excuses. So if all of human history is a showreel on repeat, what kind of movie is it that we're watching? I sometimes wonder if it's a tragedy. That's not particularly because I'm prone to depressive thoughts. Rather, it's because what I see in the often stressed and worn faces of everyday people is an at-scale human tragedy of people feeding the world with behavior that says, I am, we are willing to bend ourselves out of shape in response to the way the world works. I'm not immune, nobody is. It's an endemic. With almost no exceptions, perhaps no exceptions at all, we end up living lives that are not true to our essential selves, but are some sort of refracted, distorted, compromised version of the glory that's within us all. It's as if we all have a siren song within us, but what comes out is more often siren than song. And by bending ourselves out of shape, we end up collectively manifesting a system, an interplay between the way the world works and the way we are, that only serves our false, refracted selves. In other words, we manifest a system that doesn't serve us as who we really are at all. So is that merely a tragedy? Or is it in fact more like a horror? We all recognize that the way the world works is not in our individual or autocratic control. We imagine, I think, that this means that the thing that is more able to flex is ourselves. And so we bend ourselves out of shape for fear that the way the world works won't bend or bend fast enough to accommodate our essential selves. It's a fundamental error because on an equally fundamental level, we cannot flex. We cannot truly be other than what we are, our essential selves. As thinking, feeling, needing, loving creatures that are both selfish for security, but also selfish for purpose, contribution, freedom of thought, we must have authorship of our lives, or else live with the relentlessly dysfunctional consequences. A set of pathologies that are like a silent shriek echoing off the sides of the frame in a moral horror we call our lives. Our true selves pushed down to the sunken place, while someone else occupies our bodies, thinks our thoughts for us, speaks in our voice, but not from our soul. In our belief that it is we who need to flex and not the world that we have created and that we recreate each day through our own behavior, we end up violating ourselves and each other over and over and over again. Maybe that's all too dark. Perhaps I'm overstating it. Maybe there's more comedy than horror in how the world works, or at least farce. In our daily lives, I'll accept, we insulate ourselves from the horror and the tragedy that I've described. We wear the clothes and adopt the attitudes of our accumulated selves, the selves that we've learned to be, and that we may even tell ourselves we love and are proud of. We play out our roles and form our echo chambers. We get into bands and play tunes that we tell each other are our music. We tell ourselves that we're doing the things that matter to us, and sometimes, of course, we are. But as we sit in traffic with our briefcase by our sides on our way to another meeting, or in these COVID times as we bounce from Zoom call to Teams call to Twitter and back again, does it not all strike you as some sort of Kafkaesque madness? The sort of stuff that an outside intelligence would look in at and marvel, not because it's marvelous, but because it's bonkers. If our lives are a farce, then they're only funny like the tears of a clown. When we dance and cavort, we're dancing to someone else's tune, throwing shapes to please an audience. What we think of as our values, ourselves, and what matters to us is more often a manifestation of the pathologies of how things are than an embodiment of the truths of who we are. In the showreel of our lives, we lose sight of ourselves behind the parts we allow ourselves to play. And in losing sight of ourselves, we lose sight of each other. We end up assuming the worst of each other because we end up forgetting how to be the best of ourselves. The weird thing is that from a certain point of view, I don't think much of this adds up to a surprise. There might be nothing at all in what I've said that's new or different, or that doesn't on some level at least tap into a feeling you've already had. But the showreel rolls on. So we might ask, why is that? And one obvious answer is anxiety and fear. All of human history is rife with it, weighed under by the threat of scarcity. Generation after generation has been compelled to seek power and dominate, or offer compliance in return for sanctuary. We've all learned to become users of each other and of the natural world around us. Whether we dominate or allow ourselves to be dominated, it's all become a transaction, a bartering of what we're prepared to do to ourselves or to others in exchange for what? A chance to keep on being who we are not. We, the humans, have become the dehumanizers, treating others as objects of our intentions, imagining a race to the top where someone somehow might achieve escape velocity, might become the alpha dominator or the most conniving sycophant. But there's no speed anyone can move at that's fast enough, no shape we can twist ourselves into that will see us getting what we need. The more we hunt for it, the more the pathologies of the status quo take us into their grasp. Nobody ever kept up with the Joneses. The Joneses were a story that we imagined and that ended up ruining us all and our planet too. Okay, that's been a rough ride. I guess you came to this cinema for a good time, not for this depressing art house shtick. But maybe it's time to play you the feel-good movie to see you out. Maybe it's time for the big reveal that turns everything around, the story of hope. Well, I'm saying no. I'm saying no to hope. And I want you to consider saying no to. Trapped in anxiety and fear, enveloped in the belief that our influence is limited, we may think that the way to agitate for better is to share our stories of hope, but I think we're wrong. I think hope is a sedative for those trapped in the rat race, the mother's milk of a domination system that's set up to jam its fingers in its ears and its fists in our mouths. Hope is the blue pill that lets us forget that what we think we saw is so horrific, that allows us to plug ourselves back in while at the same time switching ourselves back off. Hope is insidious. It invites us to treat what we should demand and claim with impunity, the right to be our essential selves, as something we need to beg for, aspire towards, hope for. Hope is insidious. We allow ourselves to feel that speaking plainly, calling out the moral horror of the routine ways in which we violate ourselves and each other is a story we must not tell, something not to be named, a violation of some sacred social contract, but one that leaves us continuing to violate ourselves. We feel that we should be feeding the world with narratives of hope that invite us all to move forwards, upwards, ascending to that great and promised land. But it's an illusion. Imagining that we can change the way the world works with narratives of hope is like imagining we can cure mental illness by pretending to be mad. So don't sell me your stories of hope. You're in a horror show. So that was breezy. So my intention was to provoke you into something. My intention isn't to get you to say, yes, that's right, or that it's easy to agree with, or whatever. But hopefully you take the point here, which is if the way the world isn't, if the way the world is, rather, isn't how we want it to be, I believe that it has such incredible momentum and force behind the status quo that unless we can find an equal and opposing force, it isn't going to change. It will be deflected, but it'll just be a slightly tweaked version of the thing it already is. And I'm not sure that's what any of us are after. So for me, the idea of moral outrage is all about activating some sort of equal and opposing force that might allow us to change the course of the future. And that's what I'm interested in personally. But I think it requires us to name it. I think it requires us to see what it is about the world that isn't right. And I will concede that there is a place for hope but I would like to explore what that place is, because I do think it's after we've pointed to the moral horror and not before. So that's my perspective. I'd like to just, before we sort of decide whether we want breakout groups or whatever, I'd like to just throw it open to anyone. Would anyone like to sort of share their reactions, thoughts, their experiences? And by the way, folks, in the spirit of this being an Exploring Aloud session, I don't expect you to feel like you have to talk to me. I'd really like you to talk to each other. So let's just throw it open and ask questions and share with each other.
Well, I wanted to appreciate you. It was like a stream of consciousness, except that you probably prepared it. But,
it's all written down, yeah.
Yeah. I do hope you share the recording, because as you were reading, I felt totally with you. It was like being on a journey with you, and yeah, I felt the energy, your moral outrage, and how it landed is, yes, we need to step up and recognize that we can decondition ourselves. We can co-create the future, but not on our own. We do need each other, and we need to connect to what really, really matters to us, because nobody ever told us that. So yeah, thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks, Anna. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I'd just like to echo the point of, yeah, we can't do this on our own. My personal perspective is we have to own our own agency as well. So in so much as that has to come from us, but we can do that, I think, with more power and sustainability if we're doing it together as well. So, you know, I'm with you there. Anyone else?
I have thoughts. So I don't agree with all of that. Although I get the thread, and yes, I mean, I echo what Anna said. It was really, really smart piece of presentation. So human beings that bend themselves out of shape, it's what we evolved to do. Because we're wired to be social, and we cannot survive by ourselves unless we happen to be a truly wild person of Alaska or something like that. We are required, our whole evolution requires us to find strands of resonance, pieces of common ground, things about which we can come together, because that's what holds it together, the social thing, and it's what we need to survive. So I think we need to be kind to human beings, ourselves included, and kind of go, we're not bending ourselves out of shape because we're weak. We're not bending ourselves out of shape because we're stupid or ignorant. We're not bending ourselves out of shape out of laziness, quite frankly. We're bending ourselves out of shape because we can, because we've evolved to do it. And in the moment, what that's giving us is a sense of connection with either the system or our peers or whatever it happens to be. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. What's a bad thing is when we do it so repeatedly or to such an extent that it actually, as you say, fractures the internal self. So that's one thing. There's nothing wrong with that capability to bend to a different shape. And then sometimes we actually like the shape we've bent ourselves to better, and we'll reorientate around that. You know, when you've seen people, I've seen people who try something novel because it's at the edges of their values framework, and they think, actually, it would be so amazing if I was that version of me, an awful lot more. And initially, that's a bent out of shape activity, but it becomes them in the end. So that's one thing. Another thing is, you said, what's holding it where it is? Anxiety and fear. Yeah, kind of ish, but also there are other things holding it there. Just bulk standard inertia. You know, we have so much invested, be it individually or collectively. We built this city, so we don't want to just take it down on a whim. So we need to respect that the gravitational pull of the investment, you know, and again, it's not laziness, it's not ignorance, it is, but we can't let all that go to waste. So that makes the narrative to help people let go of that really important, because it's not about wasting, it's about building and moving on and all the rest of it. But the other thing that I'd say is, another thing that holds folk in place is a sense of honor and allegiance, a kind of greater minds than mine, kind people I have seen have been part of this, which can't be all bad. So yeah, and then my final thing, hope is insidious. So what's interesting, if you're into restorative narratives, which is a bee in my bonnet, is that stories of hope which are restorative tell hard truths plainly. They don't sugarcoat it. Mm-hmm. So actually there is a kind of hope that can be honestly presented, even to quite a granular level, where we go, this is gonna be so hard, but it's also going to be worth it. So I think it's how we package and present the hope as to whether or not it turns out to be insidious. Right, I'll shut up now.
It's all good. I predicted that you would not agree with me, Jackie. So I'm sort of delighted that I was at least right in so much as that. So here's my immediate thought, which is there's a version of myself which can agree with everything that you've just said. And I think when the moment takes me where I think, yeah, what we need to do is be balanced here, I would readily agree with it. I think part of the question I'm asking myself at the minute is whether that balance allows what I see as being wrong with the status quo to persist. And I think there are things in what you've said that, even though I can find ways to agree with them, I also want to push back on. So and again, you know, the purpose of this session isn't to try and homogenize everyone to a way of thinking, but I really have a personal sense that there is something really fundamentally wrong. That you know, if I take the first point that I heard you to make, at least, was around, you know, the ability to flex and bend is an important and valuable ability, not just the negative one that I put it across as. And I agree with that. And I think what we all do naturally is seek resonance in the world. But I think the problem that I feel is that the world that has manifest over generation after generation after generation to bring us to where we are today leaves us in a position where it leaves us almost unable to find resonance. The ways we have to bend ourselves in order to find resonance in the way the world is now is not a way that I want to bend myself. You know, what I referred to as a domination system. Screw that. You're not dominating me. I'm not going to play that tune. And there's no amount of bending that I'm going to do that puts me in that shape. And my fear is that that's the issue. So I kind of want to say yes to everything you've said. And at the same time, I want to say, no way.
I'd like to say no way.
Go on, Jose.
Nice to see you, Jackie. So I agree, as Andy did, that, yeah, there's this physical evolution, this biological evolution that has caused us to be, as you describe. But I think we also have a social evolution, which has spun us out of control. And our social evolution has learned how to maximize control over us because of our biological evolution. And so I think that the fact that we're able to adapt is wonderful. And that's what we were evolved to do. But once the system realized that we could adapt, then the system became one of forcing us to adapt. And it's doing so at a faster rate, in a more, I think, more vicious and malicious rate. And so I would push back on that, which is to say, yes, it's true, but that's not the answer. Because if we cop out on that, then we've bought into the fact that what has evolved socially is acceptable, and I would argue it's not acceptable.
So like I said at the top, you know, this is, from my point of view, we're all wrong, we're all right. But I think the discussion's a good one. David, I think you're wanting to come in.
Yeah, you know, lots of thoughts swimming around my head, so I'll try and be succinct. But something I'm coming back to is the very first thing you said, Andy, about, you know, your conclusion from your degree was that talking about morality is itself morally corrupt. And I think that's one of the, something I find tempting in what you're inviting us into, is the idea of it there being kind of an enemy and being right. And that, I think that for me is the kind of where the idea is slightly corrupted, which is that it's a outrage implies we are right and there are others that are wrong, and we can dominate you by being right. Whereas I think the thing about, and also I think there's a sort of hope in what you're, there seems to be a kind of a tension in what you're saying, which is that we're really these lovely, kind people as our true selves. And so I suppose I'm wondering about the question of, you know, what is the role of moral outrage is the question. So is it about motivating us to call it out, to call out behaviors that we see? Or is it about trying to kind of, maybe I'm still working it out, but it seems that what you're finding interesting in it is it sort of the energy of the kind of fight, you know, of bringing the fight. And so it has a slight connotation almost of the war, the kind of, you know, we're going to finally put an end to this once and for all to it, which I think is, wouldn't that be great if we, you know, we were right and we won? But, you know, I have to say I kind of agree with Jackie, and I think some of the other stuff that you were saying around the kind of fundamental assumptions of humanity, and that actually what most of us are when we listen to ourselves and given space to listen and sense with each other, we are interested in kindness and collaboration and trying to work it out. And that might mean that we go slower than we were to if we just sort of went in all guns blazing. But yeah, I suppose that's the question really. Is that what appeals to you about getting outraged? Is that the idea of kind of energy and swiftness?
I think energy, yes. Swiftness, maybe not. I'm not quite sure. I think, again, without, you know, wanting to sort of hoard the discussion too much around me, I part of my journey on this was coming from a background in, if you like, systems theory, and I guess a particular sort of church within that of, you know, it's the system, not the people. And what I increasingly started to feel about that was that actually that was an enormously disempowering way to look at the world. That if we don't believe that we have agency and some sort of personal power, I think we're in all sorts of trouble. And the minute that I started thinking down that line, I suppose I started asking myself, to what extent is my own behavior complicit in recreating forever the system that I tell people that I'm trying to change. And so that's a big part of what motivates me to talk about moral outrage, is about how can we activate our own sort of power for this. And I want to almost go beyond that. So I know, again, not everyone in this call will necessarily like this, but beyond power, I almost want to, apply the Spider-Man principle: with great power comes great responsibility. So if we genuinely buy in that we have power, then the argument I would want to make, and where the moral outrage comes in, is, well, if you have power, you have to use it. You have to, which is, again, why I was attacking the stories of hope bit, because I hear Jackie's point, and I do agree with it around the stories of hope, but it's quite a sophisticated point that she's an expert in. And there's lots of stories of hope that I think just get turned into, like I said in my little speech, a sedative to placate the masses and just keep the whole thing rolling forward. So the idea of outrage for me is about trying to activate our personal power and our personal responsibility, on the belief that it's only if we change at scale that it will change at scale. Alex.
Thank you, Andy. As I want being polite, sticking my finger up. I was just thinking, this is it's quite intellectual conversation, which I think is possibly an example of how we fall into this. And I'm really interested in the emotional side of things, so I think we all are as well. But I'm just observing the lack of emotion in this debate. So one thing that came up for me, and I'm going to provide a personal example of moral outrage, which is pretty banal, to be honest with you, but still, at least it's my story. But I was just going to talk about moral outrage for those who have been outraged in the past, who don't have any of this power we're talking about. So the one that came to mind recently, in this, or relatively recently, was all the people who were driven back to the Caribbean as part of the Windrush and the, what do they call it, the hostile environment. So there's a whole bunch of people there who I'm sure were outraged, scared, terrified, disgusted, a whole variety of emotions I can't imagine. And they clearly had no power, or very limited, so they couldn't act. So I think, for me, one thing is important is to notice that there are people outraged everywhere, but unable to act. And it sort of speaks to your point, Andy, about if you have power and responsibility. And again, it's a banal example, but I have been using this moral outrage as it is an I don't want to I'm going to use the word weapon, but it is a catalyst, maybe. And a really simple example of me is it's a very local, small example, but I volunteer at this community interest company who basically who deal with food poverty and who deal with food surplus, and they just do veg boxes from some surplus. A very simple, straightforward idea, very positive example of making a difference. It's not for profit. It's ticking a whole bunch of boxes as far as I'm concerned. And I've got frustrated because my friends who are not buying their veg boxes from this local dealing with food produce, food poverty. It is a case, for fuck's sake, what are you doing? I know, I'm the annoying newly converted who is now trying to preach to everyone. So I'm very conscious of that. What was I doing 2 years ago? Nothing, basically. But now I've discovered the path or whatever. I'm now, the moral outrage is like, yeah, I'm quite irritated. Outraged, quite close to outraged. Okay, so now it's my responsibility to do something. But I could rant, and that's not the response. I think it's the responsibility is not least because it's not going to get me anywhere. But I am inviting and having a conversation with my friends around this and just saying, this is happening. You're always having these conversations about Labour and you're left leaning. Would you be interested in doing this, and can we explore that? So it's a really safe, easy example. But I suppose in my head I'm using outrage and trying to use that power in a way that is not part of the system where we start pointing fingers and excluding people. And you're right, well, you're in the bad group now. We're all in this together for whatever reasons. You're in this, but rather than avoiding the slightly awkward conversation, and it's a small step. I'm going to have the slightly awkward conversation and then insist and push a little bit further. So I'm just building the muscle slightly in the moral outrage area, but it's just that framing, I think, is really quite powerful for me. And that sort of responsibility makes it very simple to explore that and see, oh, okay, you're angry. What are you angry about today? Okay, so what can you do about this in the right way of doing things?
Thanks, Alex. I mean, there's a couple of things immediately resonate for me. So classic sort of west of Scotland Catholic upbringing. So, you know, I never knew an emotion until I was about 25, you know. That's perhaps part of why I find, you know, the idea of outrage interesting, because I think just in the way you've described, for me, it helps me to tune in maybe to something that's kind of going on inside me and then think about, so how would I act from that? So that's one thing. The other thing that you said that really resonates for me is, for me, and I think for you, the outrage isn't directed at other people. It's directed at a circumstance. And actually, it's more for me a source of energy to kind of help me embrace my responsibility than it is for me to go and blame someone else. So in some of the stories I told in the previous session, they're outraging, but the thing that I want to do with that outrage isn't blame people. It's think about, how do we now use that to activate something in us to create better. So it's outrage at circumstances, not outrage at others. And I think that's important, because I think one of the things that, when I've talked about this to people in the past, that kind of it is an easy way to take the wrong messages, is to start worrying about, you know, we're going to create a bloodbath here. It's going to be, you know, walking around doing damage to each other. For me, that's not the point about this at all. For me, the point is about just activating our responsibility and then doing something about it. So it feels like that's, I think that was there in what you were saying, I think. Any other takers? Gabrielle, and then Anna.
Yeah, hi, thanks. This is a fascinating conversation and really thought-provoking. So I'll try and bundle my thoughts into one coherent stream. My first question is probably, if we pause and observe what is going on in the world, the question is probably, why aren't we more morally outraged? You know, we're wrecking the planet, we're treating people in abysmal ways, or giving permission for others to be treated in abysmal ways. But it's off our radar, so it doesn't really involve us too much. So why aren't we more morally outraged about the things that are happening in the world, the way that people are exploited, the way we exploit the natural environment, etc.? And I think there's something about the fact that we've almost created the conditions in which we don't talk about what do we mean by fairness, by morality, what does it mean to act in a just way. We frame things very much in economic terms. You know, even things like the idea that we should share vaccines with developing countries. You know, we've already got the best healthcare system in the world. So why do we think that it's morally right for us to also be the first ones to get the vaccine? It's framed in economic terms of, you know, there's a trade-off in terms of, you know, keeping the, you know, supply lines going and all of that. So we're constantly fed this idea that we need to think in economic terms, not in terms of what would be the humane, what would be the right way, what do we think is fair, and how do we arrive at that? And I think that's a real pity, because it takes us away from connecting to our own needs and to look at what are our own needs. And I think that relates to this point. So in nonviolent communication, there's this notion that behind every behavior lies a positive unmet need. So there's nothing wrong with the need itself. It's with the way we've learned to meet that need that is just unhelpful and devastating. So those are just some of my thoughts. I'm also really interested in in what David was saying about energy. And I think for me, there's always the question about how can we make sure that we use energy in a constructive way? How can we make sure that we're not against something, but also work towards something? You know, so if we've built the city and we're unhappy with the city, or we weren't part of the plans, then what can we do to actually create an alternative idea of what we want the city to be, not just say, oh, let's wreck it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gabriel. Again, just to pick up one of the things you said, I know you said more than this, but you know, on the point about legitimate needs that are not being met or being met dysfunctionally, totally agree. I mean, one of the underpinnings for my personal sort of exploration of this that I touched on in the stuff I said at the start was, you know, a simplistic, but I think helpful way to think about the sorts of creatures we are is that we have two headline types of need that we're trying to meet. The first one is a need for kind of security, if you like, which comes in all sorts of guises, you know, whether it's food security or, you know, just being safe or having the esteem of our peers or whatever. But the other type of need, I think, is a need to make a contribution, to have purpose, that sort of thing. My personal belief and my personal sort of outrage at the system, if you like, the construct around us, is that I think we're living with the baggage of a kind of a belief that first of all, we exist in scarcity, yeah, and then second of all, because that has been our history, that belief, we've learned that the way to motivate people is to keep leaning on scarcity, to keep threatening their security. And so if you buy into that view of the world, which is we have two types of need for security, need for purpose, if we keep leaning on this one, the purpose becomes make myself secure. And I think we're denying ourselves and each other the opportunity to actually be pulled forward by this sense of contribution and real purpose. That in a sense is where my real outrage lies, is that we keep on inflicting the threat of scarcity on each other, and through that denying each other the opportunity for real purpose. And I particularly feel outraged at that because I think that is a hangover from history, and we are arguably in a moment in our collective evolution where actually we could offer each other abundance. If the time hasn't passed, we might just be in that time. And even more outrageous from my point of view, the time will pass, because while we keep threatening each other with scarcity, the pathologies we end up wearing include things like accumulating stuff, hoarding it, using it up. You know, consumerism is rife. And what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up taking this moment of human history where we could offer each other abundance and put down those pathologies. And we're going to miss the opportunity, and we're going to burn the planet while we do it. That might sound outrageous, but I that's why in many ways this is so important to me right now, is it feels like we're in a generation where we only have a couple of generations to kind of make this shift. Otherwise, it could be too late. Sorry, I took over again. Anna, you were going to come in. Do you still want to come in?
Yeah, I can come in. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say because I've got so many different thoughts at the same time. But just picking up what you just said then, Andy, I think absolutely. I mean, if we don't change some fundamental stuff, the human race is going to not exist for that much longer, particularly because of climate change. So yeah, we're kind of sleepwalking into our own ruination as a world, really. So that's a bit problematic. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far, although I really in particular appreciated Alex, what you managed to make it more tangible for me, because I love practical application of stuff. I like engaging with the theory and a kind of conceptual level as well, but maybe I'm just not used to it, actually. I haven't really done that recently, so thank you. For me, what's really helpful about this concept that Andy has introduced to me of moral outrage is it helps me to connect my emotions to stuff that I rationally think is problematic. I'm quite a rational person. So actually, I think it's helpful for us to think about, or for us to be conscious of what is morally outrageous in order to give us that extra impetus to keep trying to change stuff. That stuff that really needs to change. And I was a bit sad when you said that you think hope is problematic, Andy, but then you did clarify and say that you were basically being provocative and you do think there's a place for hope. For me, I have to have hope. So that's, if you take that away from me, I don't know what I'm going to do. Obviously, you're not going to take it away from me as such, but yeah, I feel that we have to have hope that things can be different. But as you said, Andy, not as the starting point. We can't just be wishful. But I think for me, hope is important as part of the means that, as in, we have to think that things can be different. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Anna. Cool. Well, let me just pick up on the point about hope quickly. So some of you that have worked with me or know me well will know about Chris Argyris and some of the stuff he talks about in terms of change. So he talks about the conditions for personal change in terms of change in thinking, at least in perspective, are things like you have to have cognitive dissonance. So essentially you have to be able to see that your current beliefs and the things that are happening in the world are not compatible. So which are you going to change? But he also talks about, in order for there to be real change, you have to have a concrete and viable alternative, something to move to. So it's not enough to know that your current belief system doesn't make sense. You have to have an alternative belief system to move to, otherwise you're stuck. For me, that's where hope comes in. It's the concrete and viable alternative that we can move to. My problem with it, and the reason I wanted to offer the provocation around it, is I worry that what we end up doing is talking about all these lovely alternatives, but we don't understand what the bloody problem is. So they're not really an alternative at all. They end up getting assimilated into our current worldview and bastardized and turned into something they are not. So my kind of challenge, if you like, around leading with hope is that I think I've seen too many examples of that being a way for the status quo to kind of find comfort. So if you don't mind for a second, let me offer one final provocation on this, which is, I was talking to my wife about it the other night. She used to be a teacher and left teaching because she just frankly couldn't suffer what it required of her. And we were talking about, well, if we abandoned these narratives of hope in teaching, what would that look like? And she wanted to suggest to me that the thing that she would want to do is, sit down with the head of department and say, there are all these good things going on, and the kids are getting these great outcomes, and we tell all these stories about all the things that are good that would buy us the opportunity to say, but look, here's how it could be better. My challenge back was, if you do that, I don't think anybody hears how it could be better. Because I think if you're the head of department, what you've really just been told is, actually, I'm prepared to work hard enough to prop this shit up. So why would we bother doing the fundamental change then? Just keep sweating the idiots. I think, for me, and forgive me, I might really lose friends here, but when I think about my kids' education, I think it's absolutely inhumane. They are institutionalized from preschool age and told that the arbiters of what good looks like are out there, not in here. They're told their internal world's dysfunctional, broken, wrong. And then we wonder why they have mental health issues for the rest of their life. I don't want to go to the head of department and say, here's all the good things that are happening. I want to say this is completely unacceptable. That you put me in that room with those kids and tell me that I have to teach them things that they have no interest in when they're coming from broken homes and violent circumstances and so on. I want to connect with them as humans. I don't want to force feed them the crap that you tell me I've got to feed them. So that's my challenge, is if we buy the arduous thing or whatever, I think we have to name the problem, because hope without the problem being named is just assimilated into the status quo, and it's not really hope at all, he would argue. Sam?
I'm risking, by Jackie and maybe others, about being schooled in restorative narrative here. But just one of the things, a lot of the stuff we think about, and people may disagree, the thing that's not a cause, but the thing that seems to leak into all of this is neoliberalism, in terms of, the stuff you just said about the education system, the stuff people have spoken about, how we are kind of, robbing the planet of its natural riches and destroying the planet for ourselves, and how we do things at work. But that's kind of always there. And if you think about how that came about, in terms of that balance between hope and kind of moral outrage, it came kind of about in the 70s and 80s, didn't it, when the current economic system was failing, the Keynesian system was failing, and the bad guy there was the state, which is kind of like crushing our freedoms and our ability to be entrepreneurial. So that's where the entrepreneur came in as the kind of the savior and the hope then, in terms it'll kind of like fight off this role of the state and this kind of oppression that we're getting from the state, and it was all free to be entrepreneurial and make a life for ourselves. And we know, well, most of us now know that's failed. Certainly for the last more than 10 years, we know that's failed. But there doesn't seem to be a coherent narrative like they had before around what we need to move to, which I think is touching upon what you were just saying. Again, yeah, I think that's what's missing. So I think there is that room for hope, but I don't think there seems to be a coherent narrative that many people who see the problems with neoliberalism, but I think there's not something that many of us can agree on that's there as that new story. So yeah, that's just one of my reflections of putting together lots of things that people have been saying.
Thanks, Sam. I think that's helpful, and again, really keen for others to come in. Just a quick thought is, I found myself tortured with, those kind of from to left-hand side, right-hand side kind of pictures, where on one hand, I want to say, no, it's never as simple as that. And on the other hand, I actually think they're really helpful, because it's like, yeah, we need to give some stuff up, and we do need to embrace some new stuff, and that clarity, I think, can help. But it's like all of this discussion, I think it's not simple, is it? So, James.
I feel even more nihilistic than I think your opening kind of proposition, because I think it's kind of quite oxymoronic that you say there's hope that we can get an equal and opposite force through outrage to actually kind of change the system, and I'm not sold that that's even possible. And I think part of it is, so I can think of things that absolutely morally outrage me, and the problem is I'm too polite in it. So I don't think, we've had a very polite conversation, and I don't know how polite and intellectual and kind of go together, because outrage is raw and it's dirty, to be honest. And I think we say, well, we don't want to blame people, we want to blame the system. And I find it hard, even though I know systems, capitalism, patriarchy, they are outrageous. I find it much easier to be outraged by Rupert Murdoch and Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And I think if we're too polite with it, we don't get that momentum behind it at all. So because we do know moral outrage creates system change, it's held by the right wing, who are happy with attacking people who are generally less able to defend themselves, like Alex's example of the Windrush generation. So I feel, yeah, there's absolutely a place for moral outrage, and we should be better at expressing it. But I think we also need to be, sometimes I think it's just doing the best that we can within a system where actually agency isn't all equal, and we don't all have equal agency and equal impact on the world.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I mean, really helpful from my point of view, and you've pointed to, I think, tensions that I feel personally when I think about this stuff, that I think that politeness can be a problem. We're not all equally powerful, if you like. I mean, on some level we are, but on a meaningful other level we're not. So I'm not going to trivialize what you said by pretending that there's a simple response to it, but I think you point directly to things that are important in there. Maybe the one thing I'll just quickly reflect on is the bit about, are we blaming people or not? And I think one of the thoughts that has occurred to me on that is it's around the concept of justice. And I think when we look from here in the present back into the past and we seek justice for the sins of the past, I think that's a dead end. I think that takes us nowhere. But that's very different from standing here looking forward, saying, how do we create a just future? So if I apply that back to the, are we blaming people or not? I guess I'm not interested in people's past behavior. But if I'm working with you all, let's say as a team, then I want the opportunity to call out when you're doing things that I don't agree with. So I think in that sense, it's not about being, dance around the handbags with each other. It's about having real expectations and real conversations with each other. But I suppose my personal frame on this is that that's about looking forward prospectively at what are we going to create, rather than getting stuck in the baggage of the past where, if we worry about that, I think we end up in stalemates. I think, the Middle East, Northern Ireland, you pick your example, but worrying about how do we get justice for the sins of the past takes us nowhere. So that's my point, I think, about blame, is let's not worry about that, but let's really, have honest conversations looking ahead. Okay, I'm conscious a few people have had to leave us. We're nearly to time. Jose, go on. You saw you wanted to come in with one more there.
I don't know if we've got time, but I wonder if we have two issues. One is, excuse me, how do we change the situation? And so what does it look like? What's the new narrative? All of those kinds of things. But I see those as two separate things. I think the outrage, I wonder if the direction that we point the outrage to is not to the system or to others, but to ourselves. Do we point at ourselves for being too nice, too accommodating, too accepting, too willing to go with the flow? And if we make it so that we're no longer comfortable with all of that, then does that allow us to then find the systems, whatever it is, the new mechanisms for making the change happen, because we can no longer live with ourselves. If we allow ourselves to get to that point, then I think it will energize the creativity and the ability to make that difference. But if we just keep allowing ourselves to be okay with it, yes, it's my fault, yes, that's the way I am, that's the way I was born, that's the way the system is, everything's just the way it is, then we don't have the energy to do it. And so I think let's not point out, and certainly not at systems and everything else, because that's just a lost case. But arguing with each other isn't the right thing either. But once we allow ourselves to not be accepting of things, then we can have a conversation, because those conversations will be genuine. they won't be passive. Well, it's okay, you know, we'll deal with it another time. Sorry, I'll leave it at that.
No, don't say sorry. That's you falling into the trap of being over polite. Don't bloody say sorry, Jose. But thank you for that. I mean, maybe my last reflection on this one is, I think what you've just spoken to there feels real to me. I think in, you know, my personal reflections on, you know, my predispositions and things, it's, you know, kind of wanting to find that resonance has at times, I think, led me to accept things that I wish I hadn't accepted. And I think there is something about that self-reflection. And the other thing that it brought to mind for me was Anna Smart very kindly recorded a podcast with me in this, and it brought to mind something we touched on there, which is, for me, just this conversation, this idea of moral outrage, and the thought process it's taken me down over the last year has increasingly given me a sense that I don't need psychological safety. That's, you know, it's sort of a moot point because I'm just outraged at myself. So there's nothing that's going to come out from out there that is going to be worse than's in here, you know? So it's, you know, again, I'm a big fan of a lot of the stuff around psychological safety, but to some extent, I wonder if it's focusing in the wrong direction, because it's back to giving power to all of that. Whereas I wonder if we just need to sort ourselves out.